The breaking point did not happen quietly inside me over time, because it exploded in public during a family dinner, where everything I had buried for years suddenly surfaced in a way I could no longer control. My name is Paige Donovan. I am 28 years old, and the moment everything changed was not dramatic in the way movies show. It was cold, sharp, and impossible to take back. We were sitting at the table when the tone shifted without warning. No yelling at first, no trembling voices, only pressure that felt organized and deliberate, as if they had rehearsed the moment long before I walked through the door. My mother looked directly at me and said, "Increase it by $5,000 a month or talk to my lawyer." There was no hesitation in her voice, and no room left for conversation. My father leaned forward and added, "Either obey or get out of this house." The room felt smaller, not because of fear, but because I finally understood that the kindness I thought existed there was never real. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, and I did not try to explain myself because I already knew none of those things would matter. I looked at them once and said, "Not a chance." I stood up, pushed the chair back, and walked away from the table without looking behind me, without asking questions, and without pretending that things could be repaired with another conversation. What I did next would quietly change their lives completely. But this story is not just about me. If you had to choose between your peace and your family in that moment, what would you pick? Write your answer in the comments. Years earlier, my parents were standing in front of losing everything they owned. The pressure did not explode all at once. It tightened slowly through official letters, unanswered warnings, silent kitchen conversations, and a quiet fear that grew heavier every time Mom and Dad tried to delay choices they were no longer strong enough to avoid. The bank made it clear that the house standing in their names had turned into a liability rather than a protection. Selling it shifted from an impossible thought into a decision they could no longer escape. They were forced to place their house on the market as the pressure continued without pause. Fear of losing everything sat silently between them every single day, changing the way they spoke, moved, and even slept. I stepped into their financial reality for the first time with the quiet knowledge that no one else would stand there unless I chose to. I accepted the responsibility of becoming the main source of support without contracts, without safety, without any protection written in ink. It did not feel like a choice at the time. It felt like stepping into a role that already had my name written on it in invisible ink. The money I sent never placed my name on official documents. It controlled outcomes that could not be ignored because every transfer stopped legal action. It covered overdue payments. It prevented utilities from being shut off. It created enough space to prevent their home from being taken even while ownership remained fully in their hands. We reached a spoken understanding inside that house where no legal witness sat beside us. They promised this situation would only last for a short time. I chose to believe them because trust still felt natural to me and doubt felt like betrayal. Mom and Dad told me this support would never become a lifetime burden. They said once stability returned, they would take control again. They described my role as a bridge rather than a permanent obligation. I accepted every word because family loyalty felt stronger than logic in those moments, and walking away felt emotionally impossible. No official record held my name. There was never any adjustment to reflect what was actually happening. No written sign showed that my income had become the foundation holding their home together. I allowed that silence to continue because I believed love was stronger than documentation, and silence felt like protection. At first, the family air softened. Their voices carried relief. Gratitude showed through small gestures. I convinced myself the balance felt fair because they had struggled while I had the power to help. And being useful felt like proof that I mattered. As time moved forward, the atmosphere changed in subtle ways that were easy to ignore. Appreciation faded without argument. Dependence settled quietly into place. Our conversation shifted until support began to feel less like a choice, more like an expectation that no one thought to question, explain, or even acknowledge. Their words grew familiar in a way that no longer carried relief. Their requests settled into a pattern that slowly replaced gratitude over time, shaping the rhythm of my life without asking for permission. Rather than sounding thankful, their voices turned casual. The flow of money began to sound like a permanent part of their lives. I remained silent because I kept believing this stage would eventually end. And silence felt easier than conflict. I never tracked the exact totals because I feared what the numbers would force me to face. I understood clearly that every month the survival of their home depended directly on my decisions. Even if no one ever said it out loud, I convinced myself that I was strong instead of trapped. I told myself that reliability was something to take pride in. I believed holding a family together was a quiet responsibility. People like me were meant to carry without complaint. By the time the outside world believed their situation was stable again, the invisible structure had already taken root inside me. I found myself living inside a role that had grown slowly around my life without ever receiving formal recognition and without any clear path back. About a year later, the pressure didn't fade. It just changed its shape. Mom and Dad were no longer living inside a visible crisis because their work had stabilized enough for them to breathe again, pay their basic bills without panic and function in a way that looked normal to anyone watching from the outside. The danger of losing their home no longer felt immediate, which should have meant relief. Yet, what followed did not feel like relief to me at all. Instead of financial requests slowing down, they began to appear more often, showing up in conversations that sounded casual and unsuspicious, delivered in voices that felt lighter than before, but carried more urgency underneath. At first, the reasons sounded reasonable. Small repairs, unexpected costs, opportunities they claimed would help them maintain stability. And I continued to send what they asked for because confronting them felt like creating problems that did not need to exist. Some of the amounts started to feel strange, not because they were always large, but because the explanations felt thin, unfinished, and sometimes changed slightly when I asked even the simplest follow-up question. I noticed that I began transferring money without fully understanding what I was fixing. Yet, I convinced myself that asking too many questions would damage trust and open wounds that I believed should stay closed. My best friend Lauren appeared in my life during this period with a quiet kind of presence that never felt aggressive or interfering. She listened without pushing. She observed without accusing. She was the only person who told me that patterns like this rarely stayed harmless. And she warned me that support could slowly turn into something unhealthy if there were no boundaries. Her words were gentle, focused only on my safety and never cruel to my family. I chose to dismiss that warning because the idea that my own family could mislead me felt harsher than any financial loss, and believing Lauren would have meant accepting that trust could be misplaced in the people I loved most. The first moments that truly unsettled me did not come from the money itself, but from the way Mom and Dad began to respond when I tried to understand details. Simple questions no longer received calm explanations. Clear answers were replaced with vague phrases. Eye contact shortened. Conversations ended more quickly than they used to. Small hesitations started to live in spaces where openness once existed. When I asked how the funds were being used, their responses shifted in tone, and instead of clarity, I received irritation that made me feel as if curiosity was disrespect. When I asked for receipts or plans, they spoke about stress, exhaustion, sacrifice, and reminded me of how much they had already endured, which quietly moved the guilt back into my hands. At the same time, their lifestyle showed subtle changes that I could not easily explain. Small upgrades appeared around their home. New purchases were mentioned briefly, then brushed aside. Bills that had once caused panic were now described casually as if money had become less fearsome in their world. Even though I knew that comfort did not match their actual income, I began to notice the silence after my questions lasted longer than normal. And I found myself sitting with discomfort that no longer faded quickly, because something inside me understood that the structure I believed was built on trust had started to develop cracks I could no longer ignore. I did not stop the payments, but I stopped feeling peaceful when I sent them. And that shift changed something deeper than any number on a screen, because I realized that loyalty without clarity slowly turns into pressure that has no name but still leaves visible weight behind. 2 weeks later, the invitation arrived without any real explanation. There was no argument in the message, no mention of money, no warning, just a short request from Mom asking me to come over for dinner like old times, which immediately felt strange because those words had not been used in a very long time. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt carefully arranged, not natural, like a performance that had been rehearsed too many times before I walked through the door. Mom greeted me with a smile that stayed on her face a second too long, and Dad acted softer than usual, asking about my work. My schedule, things he normally ignored. The table was set more carefully than it needed to be, and their voices stayed calm in a way that felt practiced rather than sincere. At first, the conversation stayed light, but then Mom started shifting it gently towards stress bills, pressure, the cost of keeping things running. "You know how expensive it is to stay afloat these days," she said quietly, watching my face more than the table. Dad nodded and added, "We are trying to think bigger this time, something that makes things stable instead of fragile." I asked what bigger meant, and their eyes moved away from mine almost instantly. Dad leaned back in his chair and said, "You don't need every detail. You just need to understand we are trying to grow." Mom added quickly, "It's nothing dangerous. It's just business." That was when my sister Ashley first entered the conversation with a tone that was not curious but commanding. She leaned forward slightly and said, "Why do you always need to question everything? Just help like you always do and stop turning it into a courtroom." Her presence changed the air at the table. I tried to keep my voice steady when I asked again where the money would go. But this time, Mom's smile faded completely. Her hand pressed flat against the table as her patience disappeared. She said, "You don't get to interrogate us like strangers." Dad's voice hardened. "We don't owe you explanations about how we run our lives." Ashley tilted her head and added with a faint laugh, "You act like we're asking for something outrageous when all we've ever done is raise you." For a few seconds, the room felt suspended, like everyone was waiting for me to become quiet again, to become useful again, to return to the version of myself they expected. Instead, Mom's voice rose sharply, breaking the thin calm. "Increase it by $5,000 a month or talk to my lawyer." Silence slammed into the table. Dad did not hesitate. His chair shifted back and his words came out firm and cold. "Either obey or get out of this house." Ashley let out a short breath that sounded almost amused and said, "You think you have leverage here? You should be grateful you're even allowed to sit at this table." My hands stayed still. My voice didn't shake. Not a chance. There was no shouting after that from me. No explanation. No defense. I stood up without pushing the chair back loudly and walked past them while Mom was still staring at me like she had not expected resistance. Dad didn't follow and Ashley didn't speak again, but I could feel their eyes on me as I reached the door. This time I didn't pause. This time I didn't look back. This time I didn't carry their words with me. I simply left. And the sound of the door closing behind me felt calmer than anything that had happened at that table. The next morning changed the way I saw the people around me. I returned to work carrying a quiet decision to stay distant from everyone connected to home, not because I felt defeated, but because speaking too soon would only transform private pain into something chaotic and uncontrollable. I avoided phone calls, avoided messages, and avoided any situation that could drag me back into another confrontation that my mind no longer wanted to survive. Sitting at my desk, my hands moved automatically through familiar responsibilities, while my thoughts drifted to the night before replaying the strange calm that lingered after I walked away. I never expected that the next fracture would come through a screen. Yet, it found me there quietly, waiting between routine tasks and unanswered emails. A coworker leaned closer and asked if I was doing all right because my name had started appearing in places online that felt unsafe. I opened my phone slowly and saw the post that shifted something permanently inside me. Ashley had written a long message filled with polite wording that disguised the weight of her accusations, presenting me as a daughter who abandoned her family, a sister who valued money more than loyalty, and a person who treated boundaries as weapons instead of protection. She avoided details carefully, although she did not need them. The comments completed the story on her behalf. Relatives I rarely spoke to left messages that sounded supportive on the surface while carrying judgment underneath. Some wrote about sacrifice and gratitude in ways that were clearly meant to shame rather than understand. A few even said they had always believed something was wrong with me. Reading those reactions felt like watching a false version of my life being built by people who never asked my side. That day, I chose silence deliberately, not out of fear, but out of control. Because I understood that defending myself publicly would only strengthen the story they wanted people to believe. I muted conversations, closed applications, and forced myself to focus on work, even when my hands felt heavier, and my breathing felt slower as the hours passed. The call came later in the afternoon, arriving quietly, but carrying the weight of something long buried. My Aunt Diane had always been the type of presence that spoke rarely, and observed constantly, noticing patterns long before anyone else felt brave enough to name them. We were not close enough for casual calls. So when her name appeared on my screen, I already understood this would not be a simple greeting. Her voice sounded calm and steady, without drama, without panic, and without the kind of softness people use when they are afraid of the truth. She told me she could no longer remain silent. She explained that the money I believed was supporting legitimate business efforts had been redirected for far longer than I had imagined. She said the funds were never used the way I was told. She said the real destination had always been Ashley's private debts loans that had grown to a point where they could no longer be hidden or delayed. She did not accuse, nor did she try to soften what she was saying, because she believed I deserved clarity more than comfort. She told me Mom and Dad were aware. She told me they helped manage the transfers. She told me the business story had been easier to maintain than admitting they were protecting Ashley from consequences that were never meant to belong to me. I ended the call slowly, remaining still, long after the screen went dark, while nothing inside me felt loud or explosive, only painfully clear. For the first time, the confusion lifted completely, and the years of pressure-shifting explanations and uneasy conversations finally formed a shape that made sense. Even though that shape hurt far more than uncertainty ever had, I put my phone down and returned to my work with a different kind of silence, one that was no longer about avoidance, but about deciding who deserved access to my voice. That night, I stopped trying to fix what was never mine to save. That night unfolded in complete silence, the kind that did not feel empty, but instead felt deliberate, as though the air itself understood that something permanent was about to change in me. I sat alone at the kitchen table with my laptop open, not because I felt emotional, but because I needed to see the truth in a way that could no longer be softened by memory or excuses. I opened my bank statements and began to move through each transaction with a careful, methodical focus, allowing the numbers to confront me without resistance or denial. Every transfer date marked a season of my life that I had quietly reshaped around their survival, and every amount reflected a choice I had made while telling myself that sacrifice was simply another word for love. I created a document and started writing everything down by hand, not to shame myself, but to understand the real structure of the dependence that had formed around me. The total grew in front of my eyes, not quickly, but steadily, which made it more unsettling because it revealed just how normal it had all felt while it was happening. I did not stop even when my chest felt tight, because stopping would have meant returning to a version of comfort that I no longer trusted. Once the numbers were complete, I went into every account, every application, and every payment system that had been tied to Mom and Dad for years without question, and I removed them one by one with a calm that surprised even me. There was no shaking in my hands, no hesitation in my decisions, and no dramatic moment, because the drama had already lived in the years before this night, not inside this quiet act of separation. I did not inform them of what I had done, and I did not prepare any explanation, because I understood that speaking would only reopen doors I had just locked with clarity. I also understood that any warning would have been treated as betrayal instead of boundaries. So I chose silence not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of self-respect that I had delayed for far too long. There were no messages sent, no calls made, and no emotional speeches rehearsed in my head, because the version of me that used to explain everything had finally grown tired of arguing with people who never wanted to understand the cost. I let the silence stand where arguments used to live. And that silence felt heavier than anger, but it also felt real in a way that nothing else had. As the night continued, I noticed that my emotional state shifted slowly but clearly, moving away from hurt and passing into a kind of emotional clarity that felt almost cold but deeply stable. There was no longer confusion, no longer hope that someone would change, and no longer the fantasy that loyalty alone could repair what had been built on manipulation and quiet entitlement. I closed my laptop without ceremony and sat back in my chair, feeling a kind of stillness that did not feel like peace, but felt like control, returning to a place it had been missing from for years. I realized that I was not angry. I was not panicked. And I was not grieving, because what I felt in that moment was something far more solid, which was the certainty that I had finally chosen myself without seeking permission. When I turned off the lights and went to bed that night, I did not feel brave, dramatic, or heroic, because none of those words felt honest. Instead, I felt clear, steady, and distant from the chaos that had shaped too many of my decisions. And that distance felt like the first form of safety I had experienced in a very long time. Within 1 week, their reality began to shift. I did not witness the changes inside that house because I chose distance carefully. Yet information has a strange way of traveling through people who talk too much or feel too curious. I continued living my days without checking on them, without asking questions, and without offering even the smallest form of support. While stories began reaching me through voices that carried no emotional connection, only observation. The bills appeared first, not quietly, not politely, but in thick envelopes that moved from mailbox to kitchen table with a weight that could not be ignored. Power notices, overdue water statements, insurance demands, and property-related warnings began stacking in places where denial used to sit comfortably. I learned these details from a neighbor who had always looked at our family with admiration before yet now spoke with a softer tone that suggested everything behind their front door had started to fracture. Shortly after that, legal letters followed arriving in formal packaging that carried words like default, breach, outstanding balance, and final notice. Bank communications stopped being negotiable conversations and shifted into structured demands that left no space for emotional appeal. A distant cousin told me that process servers had begun appearing near the house, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the slow patience of people who knew they would eventually be answered. Ashley's situation shifted in silence rather than chaos. There were no dramatic scenes that reached me, only quiet shifts in her visible lifestyle that others began to notice before I ever did. Her social media posts became fewer. Her appearance at gatherings became rare, and the assumption that she could fix anything with a phone call slowly disappeared from the conversations of people who used to treat her as untouchable. I was told that her reliance collapsed faster than anyone expected because she had never prepared to stand without the foundation that was no longer there. Mom and Dad began losing more than money. Their reputation in the small community surrounding them softened, then dulled, then quietly shifted into something that no longer inspired trust. Invitations shortened. Conversations cooled. Neighbors who once lingered at the fence now greeted them from a distance. If they greeted them at all. Their names stopped being spoken with admiration and started being carried with hesitation, which can be more painful than judgment. The collapse did not happen through a single loud event. It happened through slow disappearances, a friend who stopped calling, a church group that stopped checking in, a community project that replaced them without explanation. I never attended any of the gatherings where these changes unfolded because I had already stepped away from that world. Yet, people who noticed the shift felt the need to relay it to me with voices that sounded uncertain and oddly respectful. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard these things. I did not feel revenge, nor did I feel triumph. What I felt was distance measured and calm, as if the emotional cords that once connected me to their outcomes had been cut cleanly without splintering. I listened, acknowledged, and returned to my own routines without any desire to intervene. The loudest part of their consequences was the quiet way their world became smaller because shrinking spaces do not announce themselves. They simply stop appearing. I learned this through secondhand stories, through half-finished sentences, through pauses in conversations where people expected me to respond with emotion that I no longer had. By the end of that week, their reality had shifted completely, and mine had become still structured and free from a responsibility I no longer carried. Months later, my life no longer revolved around emergencies. My mornings became quieter, and my thoughts finally belonged to me, rather than to problems that were never meant to be carried on my shoulders. For the first time in many years, I began to design my financial life with intention, creating habits that felt stable instead of frantic, preparing for a future that was built on calm decisions rather than fear-driven reactions. I opened new savings accounts, set clear monthly structures, and allowed myself to feel secure without waiting for the next crisis to appear. The distance between me and my family stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a choice I made with clarity. I no longer saw separation as abandonment or weakness because I understood that stepping back was the only way to protect the parts of me that had been ignored for too long. I stopped checking my phone for apologies that would never come. And I stopped imagining conversations that would never be honest because I realized that peace does not depend on people changing. It depends on me refusing to accept what breaks me. The most important shift happened quietly inside my own mind, where I finally understood that boundaries are not acts of cruelty, nor are they betrayals of love. A boundary is a line that shows where respect begins, where self-worth breathes, and where my life deserves to exist without being consumed. I learned that love without limits turns into slow destruction, that silent endurance is not strength, and that choosing myself is not selfishness, but survival. I became someone who listened to intuition instead of guilt. who valued peace instead of approval, who built a future based on choice rather than obligation. The hardest lesson I learned was that love without boundaries is not real love. It is slow erosion of identity and purpose. Protecting your peace does not make you cold. It makes you honest. You are not responsible for fixing other people's chaos, especially when it costs your own stability. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step away, quietly, choose yourself without drama, and accept that self-respect will always be more valuable than approval. Thank you for staying with me through this story and for giving these memories the space they deserved. I appreciate every reader who took time to feel the emotions behind these words. Now I want to ask you something honestly. If you were in my position, what would you have done differently? And at what moment would you have chosen yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments.